John chapter 5. We've been there for a little bit. It's interesting the way that Jesus teaches in this section. And in John in particular, I think you really see this side of Jesus' teaching style. He's not like Paul. Paul will carry on an argument, like a logical argument. Therefore, for this reason, if this, then that. And then next chapter, therefore. And then he'll unpack it for a chapter. And like Romans 9 through 11 is one long argument. Just chapters of logical argument. Jesus kind of circles around a topic. He'll talk about being one with the Father, and then he'll talk about some stuff, and then he'll talk about how he does nothing apart from his Father's will, which is kind of like saying he's one with the Father. And he just kind of keeps circling around the topic, and it's more like an extended meditation. But that's not to say there's not a logic to it. It just sometimes sounds like, wow, he just kind of keeps talking about the same thing, but he just kind of keeps hitting it from a different angle. So we're gonna keep working through John chapter 5, specifically this monologue of Christ's, where he is explaining some things. He's in the midst of an explanation to the Jewish leaders about who he is in light of their disapproval of his healing of an invalid on the Sabbath. And Jesus has told them a few things up to this point in the monologue as we've studied it so far. We know that Jesus told them that he has the authority to work on the Sabbath because his Father works on the Sabbath, which implies that he's equal with God. But he's clarified for us that equality does not mean that he's in any way opposed to his Father. And in fact, Jesus told these men that he works in submission to and in perfect unity with the will of his Father. He told them that the Father loves the Son and has given the Son authority to raise up life from the dead. He told them that the Father has given the authority to the Son to execute judgment on the last day. He's told them that he is to be honored with the same honor that the Father is to be honored with. He's told them that those who believe in Jesus have experienced the reality of a resurrection in a spiritual sense. And that implies that they will experience a physical resurrection of life, Jesus calls it. And he's also told them that those who do not walk in obedience and manifest that they have not truly been born again or had a spiritual resurrection, they eventually will experience another type of resurrection, which Jesus refers to as a resurrection of judgment, where they will be physically raised from the dead on the last day in order to be judged. Those are a few of the things that Jesus has hit already in this monologue, and since we've been chewing on it, I think that's probably pretty familiar to you as well. Look at verse 30, which is where we're starting off today. Jesus says, I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Well, this sounds a lot like some of the other things that Jesus has already been saying in terms of the unity of his mind, the unity of his actions with the Father. And specifically, what's happening here is Jesus is kind of circling back around to hit that topic again. He's kind of closing off one section of his discourse here. And specifically, he's kind of hitting the tail end of what he just talked about in verse 29. Namely, that there's going to be a resurrection of judgment. And who's going to be the judge? Jesus is going to be the judge. Verse 30, I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge. So my judgment is going to be not on my own, but it's going to be in accordance with whatever the Father wants me to do. So I will be a just judge on the last day. My judgment is just because I do not seek my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Okay, so Jesus is going to do precisely what his Father desires. As he acts as judge, he will be a just judge. The passage is just tying up that last thought from the previous passage. That's what's happening in verse 30. At the same time, Jesus is now going to move into his next topic, and he's kind of prepared the way by talking about the unity of mind that he has with his Father, because the next topic he's going to talk about is that Jesus is not acting out on a rogue mission on his own. There are others who testify to the legitimacy of who he is and what he's doing. And so he brings us into this next section by saying, hey, I'm doing what my Father wants me to do, remember? Verse 31. If I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true. Remember, I'm one with the Father. I'm thinking together. I do whatever the Father wants me to do. I'm not a rogue. And if I were to just be testifying about myself and I'm the only person who has anything to say about who I am, then that would demonstrate that my testimony actually is not true. The truthfulness of Christ's identity has to be demonstrated beyond his own autobiography about himself, his own testimony about himself. And there is more to Jesus than his personal claims. Verse 32. There is another, he says. There is another who bears witness about me. And I know that the testimony that he bears about me is true. So I'm not just making a claim for myself. There's another who makes a claim about me. So I have substantial support. So who is this other one who testifies? Who is it? Well, perhaps the Jewish leadership thinks he's referring to John the Baptist, because John the Baptist testified. So Jesus addresses this notion that maybe you're thinking about John the Baptist. Verse 33. You sent to John, and he has borne witness to the truth. Not that the testimony that I receive is from man, but I say these things so that you may be saved. I'm bringing up John, not because I need John's affirmation, but it might be helpful for you to remember what John had to say about me. He was a burning and shining lamp, and you were willing to receive for a while. You were willing to rejoice for a while in his light. So Jesus speaks of another one who testifies, and then 3 verses that momentarily set our eyes on the Baptist. In the first one, Jesus says, remember when you sent to John? We read about it in John chapter 1. You guys sent to John. He's out in the wilderness. You sent a delegation out to John. You were asking about who he is. And what did he do? He bore witness to the truth. He said, I am not the one you're looking for. There is another who comes out after me, whose sandals I'm not worthy to stoop down and untie, or I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's another one coming. That's the one. He testified about the truth. The second thing that Jesus tells us about the Baptist is in verse 34. Jesus, as I mentioned, he's clarifying that Jesus himself doesn't need a mere human being, John the Baptist, to tell Jesus who Jesus is. Not that the testimony that I receive is from man. In other words, Jesus says, another's testified of me. You might be thinking I'm referring to John, because John did in fact testify. But my own sense of the truthfulness of my identity does not rest upon John's testimony. He was a testifier, but there's something more substantial that's needed to back up what I'm saying. However, I say these things about John so that you might be saved. And so he's not totally discrediting John. He's just saying he doesn't need John. Does that make sense? I'm reminding you about John's for your sake, that you might remember what he said and that you might be saved. Because, verse 35, apparently you were willing to rejoice for a while in John's light. Apparently, among the Jewish leaders, there was a short period of willingness to accept the Baptist testimony. At least consider it. This is the first I've heard it. This is the first we've heard of it. But Jesus says right here, for a while you were willing to accept his testimony. So, the claims about Jesus, or let me say it this way. Jesus' claims about himself are not sufficient to demonstrate the truthfulness of those claims. But he has support for his claims, substantial support. There is another who testifies, he says in verse 32. You might be thinking he's talking about John, who did indeed testify, which might be helpful for the Jews, but Jesus himself doesn't need that. So is John the Baptist that substantial testimony that Jesus is referring to? No, he's not. As important as John the Baptist was, Jesus has somebody else in mind. Verse 36. But the testimony that I have is greater than that of John. Okay, so we're tracking with his train of thought. Who is it? Or what is it? For the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I am doing bear witness about me. So what bears witness about him? The works that the Father gave him to do bear witness about him that the Father has sent him. Verse 37, and the Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. Which is to say, that the works that the Father gave Jesus to accomplish, the very works that he's doing, bear witness about the fact that the Father sent him, and in fact, that is the Father's testimony that he did send Jesus. The works of Jesus, everything from his miraculous signs to his work of redemption that's going to be coming on the cross, all the works of Jesus back up the claims of Jesus. These works are a substantial secondary testimony, and more specifically, they are the Father's testimony about Jesus. These works are given by the Father for Jesus to accomplish, and as we've seen, when Jesus does these works, when Jesus does his work of raising up the invalid at Bethesda, when Jesus does his work of resurrection, he told us, when Jesus does his work of judgment at the end of the age, what we are seeing there is a display of the Father. So it's not merely Jesus who's standing behind his own claims as he does the works. It's the Father who's standing behind the claims of Jesus, because the works are the Father's works on display in Jesus. Like he said in verse 30, he only does the will of the Father, and therefore when Jesus does these works, it's the Father's will, and therefore the works are the Father's affirmation. The man who does these works of God has been sent by God. So, the claims of Jesus are not sufficient to demonstrate the truthfulness if those claims are all that he has. But there's substantial support. There's another who testifies. He's not mainly referring to John the Baptist. He's referring to God the Father. And God the Father endorses the Son and the Son's claims. And the way that the Father endorses Jesus is by means of the works performed by Jesus. And when Jesus performs those acts of God, it is the Father's public stamp of approval on Jesus. Verse 37, the Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. And yet, there's a problem. Jesus is doing the works of the Father, which means the Father is testifying about the Son through the works of Jesus, but apparently, these guys don't hear the testimony. By the power of Christ's own words, he raises a bedridden man to his feet, giving him the strength to carry his own bed around town, a work through which the Father is testifying to the world, saying, this man Jesus, who performs the wonders of God, was sent by me, God. And the only thing that these guys have to say about it is that man's not allowed to carry his mat on the Sabbath. Okay? You're not listening. You're not listening to the testimony of the Father by watching what Jesus is doing and saying, he's got to be from God. It's got to be. This is how the blind man in, is it John 9? When we get there, the man who is who's given sight, and the Pharisees, they say to him, like, who is this man? And he argues this way. He's like, this is funny that you don't know who he is. Have you ever heard of anybody who restores the sight of the blind? This is the kind of thing God does? And you're wondering where Jesus is from? 1 + 1 =. You're not listening. Verses 37 to 38. And the Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. His voice you have never heard. His form you have never seen, and you do not have his word abiding in you, because you do not believe in the one whom he has sent. That's how I can tell. You've never heard him, you've never seen him, and you don't have the word of God in you. 3 significant problems with these men, 3 ways in which they are missing the Father's testimony, 3 ways in which they are out of sync with the people of God, the people of faith, throughout the history of the Old Testament. Because they heard God's voice. They, in some sense, saw God, and you better believe that the Israelites had the Word of God in their hearts, the true Israel, who were those of faith. His voice you have never heard. Verse 37. Noah heard God's voice, Genesis 7. Abraham heard God's voice, Genesis 12. Moses, Exodus 3 and 4. Samuel, 1 Samuel 3. And Elijah, 1 Kings 19. They all heard God's voice. But these guys to whom Jesus speaks, they do not hear the Father's testimony because unlike the people of faith who came before them, they have never heard the voice of God. His form you have never seen. Now, John 1:18 says, no one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. Nobody has ever seen God. And there is a sense in which that is absolutely true. Nobody has ever seen God with the kind of clarity that they are going to see God in Jesus. But that actually doesn't mean that there's no sense in which nobody ever saw God in the Old Testament. In some sense, Abraham saw God in Genesis 18. Jacob saw God and wrestled with him in Genesis 32. Moses saw God in Exodus 33. Isaiah saw God in his vision. Remember, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. What does he say? I was in the temple, and the train of the temple the train of his robe filled the temple with his glory, and there were seraphim, and he saw an image of God in some sense. So John 1:18 says in some sense no one has ever seen God. Not with the clarity like we're going to get in Jesus. But that doesn't mean that there weren't people in the Old Testament that had some ability to perceive the reality of God. When Solomon built the temple and brought had the priest bring the Ark of the Covenant into the Holy of Holies, there was a cloud that descended upon the sanctuary of the temple. When Israel is going through the wilderness, the tabernacle that has the glory cloud that descends and rises, people had some perceptivity of God in some sense, but these guys, they have no perception of God. Unlike the people of Israel who came before them, the people of faith. And you do not have his word abiding in you. Bible saturation is a defining characteristic of a true Israelite. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. Joshua 1:8. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that will bear its fruit in its season. Day and night. But these men listening to and watching Jesus do not perceive the Father's testimony in the works of Christ, because unlike God's people of faith who came before them, they do not have the Word of God abiding in them. They don't hear, they don't see, they do not have the Word of God abiding in them. And the way you can tell is in verse 38, the last phrase, for you do not believe in the one whom he has sent. And the implication is, if you could see, if you could hear, if you had the Word of God abiding in you, you would not reject Jesus. Because here's the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Unless you're blind and deaf and unaware of what the Bible teaches, unaware of the Bible's storyline. Now, what's behind their inability to hear God's testimony in Jesus? What's behind this? What's at the root of that error? Why don't these men recognize the Father's testimony? And then in the next paragraph, verses 39 to 47, it seems that Jesus says there are 2 issues beneath this deafness, blindness, and lack of the Word of God abiding in the heart. 2 issues. There's a heart issue, and there's a Bible issue. And we'll talk about the Bible issue next week, I think. I have to figure out if I can somehow weave that into Mother's Day. Bible issue next week. Today I want to talk about the heart issue. There's a heart issue in these guys that lies underneath their inability to be perceptive to the testimony of the Father in Jesus. The heart issue can be seen in verses 41 to 44. Everything else in that next paragraph is all about the Bible issue, so I'm not going to hit any of the other verses in that paragraph. Let me read to you verses 41 to 44. Here's the heart issue. Jesus says, I do not receive glory from people, but I know that you do not have the love of God within you. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. How can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? Okay, again, this is like, okay, what are you talking about? I'm not following here. We have to slow down. We have to chew on it. He begins addressing the heart issue by saying something about himself. He says, I do not receive glory from people. Which is like, wait, really? Because in verse 20, you just said that the Father shows the Son great works so that people will marvel. And then in verse 23, you said that the Father's intention is that we will honor you, Jesus, with the same honor that we would give the Father. So what do you mean you don't receive glory from people? Because that's two instances of it right there in the same monologue. So what does Jesus mean when he says he doesn't receive glory from people? He's not talking about the fact that he will be worshipped as the Son of Man. He's talking about the fact that he does not live for the sake of being approved by people, in the sense that he's not guided by a people-pleasing agenda in which he sells out on his mission, he sells out on his identity, and he follows the whims of the fickle ratings of his peers. Instead, like he told us in verse 30, I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. I seek the Father's will. I seek the approval of the Father. I seek to please the Father because he admires and he honors the Father. He loves the Father. He wants the approval of the Father. That's his motive. That's what drives his heart. And his love for the Father and his love for the approval of the Father, not his love for the fickle approval of people. And this is what keeps him on target. Whether people like him or not, he's not gonna bend just because he wants people to like him. He wants God's approval. So he doesn't bend. And that's not the case for the men with which Jesus is talking. These guys do not have a love for God. And that's exactly what Jesus says in verse 42. But I know that you do not have the love of God within you. And we're starting to see the heart issue here. Jesus knows their hearts, and he calls them out. He does this throughout the book. We've seen it with Nicodemus. We saw it with Nathanael. We saw it with the woman at the well. He sees the heart, and he calls it out. Verse 42, I know that you do not have the love of God within you. They don't love God. They don't share Christ's God-honoring agenda. Apparently they have another agenda. Apparently they have another love. What happened to them is what happened to all of humanity, according to Paul in Romans chapter 1. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God. The immortal God who is to be loved, they exchanged that glory. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, Paul says. They love something else more. This is that awesome passage in Jeremiah chapter 2. My people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living water, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. They don't love the great, glorious God. They've got something else that they want. What is it? Their agenda starts to become a little clearer in the next verse, verse 43. Jesus says, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. Okay, so you don't love God. I come in the name of God. You reject me, but another person comes and they come in their own name, and you will accept them. We're starting to see, what is it that they love? What is it that they love? Jesus sets out his own agenda, compares it with what these men love. Jesus comes in his Father's name. This other person comes in his own name. And the Jewish leaders gravitate toward that person. They won't receive Jesus, but they will receive this guy. What's going on? He's contrasting himself with another type of, you might say, a leader, or another type of person. Jesus, who loves the Father, he comes in the name of the Father, meaning that he is a representative of the Father. He comes to glorify the Father. He comes for the sake of the name of his Father. He comes to make his Father known. He lives in submission to the Father. He desires to please the Father. He wants the Father's approval on what he's doing. Jesus is God-centered. He's very God-oriented. He's very God-exalting in what he's doing. And these guys don't love God. So they don't, quote, receive Jesus, is the word he uses in verse 43. So what do they love? Well, let's look at the other type of person. This is the person that is contrasted with Jesus. This person comes in their own name, meaning he comes as a representative of himself. He comes to put himself on display. He comes to glorify himself. He comes for the sake of his own name, to make his name known. I want you to know who I am. He's not in submission to the Father. He desires to please the crowd because he wants the people's approval of his name. He doesn't care about whether or not God approves of what he's doing. He cares about whether you approve of what he's doing, because he wants to make a name for himself. He is self-centered. He is a self-oriented person. And we're not talking about a particular person that Jesus has in mind here. We're talking about a type of person that these men tend to gravitate toward in a leader. It's this self-oriented type of person that these leaders give approval to. This is the type of person that they will, again, receive, verse 43. They love something about the self-oriented type of person. And what is it that they see and love here? What do they see in this person that they love so much that they gravitate toward? Verse 44. How can you believe in me, the one who comes in the name of the Father, when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? These guys do not seek glory from God. They don't seek God's approval. What they hunger for is something else. God is not the treasure, and they don't long to be taken in by God, therefore. Why would you, if you don't care about him? Why would you want glory from a bag of marshmallows? Why would you want approval from that if you don't really care about it? If you care deeply, you will want to be received in. If you admire deeply, you will want to be accepted by that one, that person. Instead, they want to be received by others. The most important thing for them is that other people approve them. They want, quote, glory from one another. And since Jesus doesn't provide that for them, Jesus is not admiring and affirming them, they don't embrace him. These men love to hear people tell them how great they are. And it determines who they're going to receive. They're enslaved to it. They're enslaved to their love for praise. Let's put the pieces together. Okay, Jesus is seeking approval from God, the glory that comes from God. He comes in the Father's name. He maintains his Father's agenda. Therefore, he doesn't flatter these guys. He speaks the truth, and they reject him. They don't receive him. But if another comes along and pursues a name for himself, pursues praise for himself, then they will receive this person. And the reason they're going to receive this person is because they love being praised by other people. Here's the picture Jesus is drawing. A man comes along, wants to make a name for himself, and he goes to people who love to be flattered. And unlike Jesus, he flatters them. And they receive him. Because they love being praised. And he's telling them what they want to hear. So they praise his name. And everybody wins. He flatters them, which they love, and they praise his name, which he loves, and they all love being told by one another how great they are. Because what they love most is people who will praise them. John returns back to the same topic in chapter 12, verse 43, and he says, they loved the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. This is the heart issue that underlies their rejection of Jesus and their inability to hear the Father's testimony. These men have traded their love for God and for his approval, and they have traded it for the praise of men. Rather than loving God, rather than living to please God, rather than living for the embrace of God, they love and they live for the praises of people. And in their hearts, in the words of Ed Welch, people are big and God is small. And it's a very common problem that humanity faces. It's a spiritual epidemic, in fact, I would argue. It doesn't usually take an obvious form. Very few people would actually self-identify as narcissists who live for the praise of others. Not a lot of people. It's gotten really bad if you're openly regarding yourself that way. Normally, we use more subtle labels like people-pleasing or peer pressure. It's another way that we talk about this. You're living under the watchful eye and pressure of what other people think about you. Or codependency, or perhaps the most insidious of them all in our culture, since we tend to view it so positively, we actually nurture this in our society. It's this mania surrounding the concept of self-esteem, or self-worth. And all of these labels are dealing, in one way or the other, with the same deadly issue. In one way or another, people are obsessed with and controlled by what other people think about them. Or at least what they think other people might be thinking about them. And this is what the Bible refers to as the fear of man. Proverbs 29:25. The fear of man lays a snare. And that doesn't mean I'm scared of others, like it kind of sounds. In the same way that the fear of the Lord doesn't mean I'm scared of God in the way that I'd be, like the way Unsolved Mysteries made me scared, like freaked out. Okay, the fear of man is don't think scared of others necessarily, though that could be entailed. The fear of man is more like an obsessive craving to be approved by someone whom you, in some sense, adore and have come to need them for your own stability, your own emotional stability. It's a combination of intense admiration and longing for acceptance by the one that you admire. It's a yearning for approval from someone whom you essentially are worshiping in that moment. And it's a snare. It is a deadly trap, and it is enslaving. And for these men, it made them incapable of believing in Jesus, because Jesus won't play their game. He will not flatter them, because he's not living for their approval. He's not going to flatter them just so he can get them to pat him on the back. He's not going to play the game. And so they won't receive him because he won't praise them. The fear of man, living for the praise of others. Deadly. absolutely, spiritually, emotionally, socially deadly. And we've all experienced this in one form or another. We probably all continue to struggle with it to some degree. For some of us, we don't merely desire to be liked by others. We have gotten to the point where we actually need it. We are in the snare. I have ingested a sickening dose of this in my past. I can think of it in past relationships. I can think of it in like the crisis I was going through in middle school. Enslaved to the opinions of others. We are dominated by it when we're experiencing this. We're thirsting for other people's approval. We are craving other people's approval. And we get so introspective. We're looking within ourselves, replaying every conversation. We're thinking about how we look. We're thinking about how we talk and the tone of our voice and our mannerisms and how we interacted in that conversation earlier in the day and our personalities and our sense of humor and the way that we laughed and kind of snorted when we did it and very self-conscious. And for some of us, it comes out in the form of being really easily embarrassed or really shy or very aggressive. Sometimes we're overcommitted because we can't say no because we don't want to let people down. We're afraid of what they will think of us. We tell small lies, we exaggerate the truth to kind of keep the image going. We're easily depressed, we're easily angered, we're easily annoyed and frustrated because we're thinking about the way that other people might be viewing us, and we're constantly wondering what other people think about us because we're insecurely craving their approval in these moments. And we psychoanalyze every comment they made, every gesture of their body language. And we live our lives revolving around their opinions or what we imagine their opinions might be. Sometimes we don't even know. We're playing the scene in our mind, trying to interpret every little thing that maybe was implied by that. The fact that they showed up a few minutes late. So we posture ourselves. We one-up each other. We intimidate others. We prepare ourselves. We have imaginary conversations in hopes of kind of readying ourselves for the next interaction with the people that we're idolizing in that moment. Obsessively self-aware of every move we make, constantly mindful of ourselves, constantly mindful of the responses of others, controlled by this desperate desire for them to somehow fill an emptiness inside of us that never seems to be satisfied when we're living this way. So we masquerade through life, we're putting up the best face, we're behind a mask, but insecure behind it all, and dreading the thought that anybody maybe would see what's really there. And we are horrified that they won't like the show. And we're miserable in our attempts to seek praise. We're miserable when we actually do get people to praise us because it's fleeting. And what if we do something to lose it? We're miserable when we don't get praise. We are miserable because people are very big to us in those moments. And we give them the honor of actually ruling our lives, of being masters. We give them the honor of having mastery over our lives because they are profoundly significant to us. This is worship. This is what you do with something you worship. And when it's happening, people are big and God is small. And the solution is not self-esteem. If we are enslaved because we live for the praises of others, we will not be healed by praising ourselves instead. My greatest need is not satisfied by highly valuing myself in this moment. Highly valuing what I think of me. Jesus doesn't say to these men, you seek approval from others, but what you really need is to love yourself more. Approve of yourself more highly. It's not going to free them. The issue is not their need to love themselves. The issue is that these men don't love God. They do not esteem God highly enough. Verse 42, you do not have the love of God within you. That's your issue. That's the issue. Either highly esteeming these people or highly esteeming God. The answer is not highly esteem yourself. These guys have a very small view of God, and that's why they don't care about God's approval. If they had a higher view of God, if they admired God instead, if they are infatuated with God instead, if they worship Him instead of people, then they would long to be received by Him, to be taken in by Him, to be accepted by Him. They would long for Him to set His approval on them, and they would live for His glory. The gift of His affirmation, the gift of His approval of their life, and they would receive the one then who came in the Father's name, because they want the Father. And He's putting the Father on display. It's a cool thing when people admire you. When people you admire you. It's a cool thing. It feels good. I want my kids to like me. Why? Because I admire them. I want them to like me. I want my wife to like me because I admire her. I want you guys to like me because I admire you. And there's nothing intrinsically evil about a simple desire to be liked by the people you love. I'll throw on a little cologne for Amy. I want her to... You like me? I'll throw on some deodorant for you guys, because I don't want to drive you away. But if I idolize you and your praise, if I have a fear of man and I live for your approval or for her approval or for their approval, this is a merciless false god. And you know what's infinitely better? Infinitely better than insecurely striving to be accepted and praised by other people. You know what's better? Knowing that the one who is most admirable of all, whose beauty and perfection exceeds even the most wonderful of all earthly people. Knowing that the great God above all things, who sees beneath my masquerade and who searches out the dark depths of my sin and knows precisely who I am and the full extent of my unworthiness, has nevertheless paid my debt, freely brought me into His care, accepted me into His family, and become my advocate. That is more satisfying than being liked by you. And I really admire you guys. He knows me, and yet He chose me. And He brought me into His household and has become my advocate. He adopted me as a son. He took me into His kingdom and became for me a stronghold of safety against my greatest adversaries. The Lion of the tribe of Judah has made His love pour out on me. He has taken me into Himself, and His infinite strength is no longer a threat to my safety. His infinite strength is now my defense. He has, in His infinite purity, provided a robe of righteousness and has clothed the shameful nakedness of my sin-defiled soul with the life-giving blood of Christ. Christ has made me His brother, Hebrews says, chapter 2, verse 11. His Father is my Father, and I have become a co-heir with him in his eternal inheritance. I have been bought at Calvary, forgiven, justified in the courtroom, accepted into the family, filled with the spirit of sonship. And I ask you, to whom would you rather be enslaved? Who would you want to be your master? Whom would you have rule over your life? For whose approval and for whose affirmation are you going to live? Are you going to spend your days worshiping and bowing down to the whims of the erratic opinions of your fellow sinful man, clamoring to be liked by people, and in misery, by the way? Or will you have freedom from that hopeless path of spiritual carnage by living daily in the light of the guaranteed gracious acceptance of an invincible God who has proved the demonstration of his indestructible love for you at Calvary, who has affirmed and assured his acceptance of us by the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and who has already granted the down payment of our eternal fellowship with him by the resurrection power of his Holy Spirit who lives in us right now? From whom will you seek affirmation? Do not worship and fear man, which is a rejection of the love of God and produces a life of misery and blindness to the glory of Jesus and inhibits our ability to trust in him. That's what these guys are doing. They are enslaved and they cannot see because they love being praised by people so much. Instead, worship and fear God. Set your attention on Jesus. Reject the idolatry. Reject the slavery of living for human praise. Take every thought captive. When you see it happening, when you feel your heart going there, you feel your mind going there, take every thought captive. Bring it into submission to the reality that you do not need the glory that comes from man. You do not need it. Receive the gift of the glory that comes from God and is granted freely to the unworthy who put their hope in him. You have to choose. You have to choose whose affirmation will you live for. Fear of man lays a snare. You want to know what the second half of the proverb is? But whoever trusts in the Lord is safe. Let's live there. We are Christians. That's where we live. That's our thing. We put our hope, we put our trust in the Lord, not in what other people will think about us. Let's pray.